right. Again, good morning. Try not to blast y'all through the microphone. It's too early for that. But thank y'all very much for being here, and look forward to your questions and your participation after our presentations. I'm Luke Morgan. I'm the panel chair and organizer and also presenter here in a moment. And I'd just like to go over briefly the bios of the wonderful people that will be presenting with me today. So very quickly and briefly, and Luke Morgan, second year PhD student here at Texas Tech in English. I've sort of grounded my research in the intersections between eco-criticism and Western American literature. And I am looking forward to taking my quals next week and then writing a dissertation after. So that's enough about me. Just to my right is Mike Lemon, who is a doctoral candidate at Texas Tech University's English department. His research interests range from turn of the 20th century regional American literature to graphic novels. He's teaching a class in graphic novels right now. That is super cool. And his presentation today discusses the intersections between digital humanities and nature writing courses, which should be fascinating. Scott Morris, to my far right, is a literature and creative writing PhD candidate at Texas Tech University. He has an MFA in creative writing from Brigham Young University, and his current project focuses on food, family, and travel writing with an emphasis in the quirky styles of essay. Excuse me. His essays have appeared previously in Brevity, the Chattahoochee Review, Essay, and elsewhere. The essay he will be discussing today will appear this summer in the Wildness Journal. So I will actually launch us off, and then we'll hear from Mike and from Scott. Good. My project this morning is developed out of sort of some pedagogical experiences I had last semester. So I'll sort of lapse in and out of a more proper reading and also a little bit of narrative and asides. So I want to start with just a little bit of an anecdote about that. The class that I taught was a food writing course, and it was structured around sort of just understanding where our food comes from, very fundamental questions, which, as we might know since we think about these things that maybe a little bit more than others, are not questions that a lot of people ask themselves. So I ended up in this situation with a pretty good class, pretty robust and willing to learn group, who were understandably a little bit skeptical of Michael Pollan and some of the other authors that we read. So we ended up with this situation all the time, and I would hear it this way. I definitely think about this differently now, they would tell me. But none of my habits have really changed, right? And so as an instructor, you're somewhere between like, yeah, oh, right, a little deflated by this sentiment. So it was this sort of thing that drove my consideration of this paper. And I sort of reasoned with myself, what will right do I have to convert these students? I told them I wasn't here to convert them, right? I just wanted them to think critically about these issues. But I lied. I kind of wanted to convert them, right? And I myself was not a full convert, right? I didn't walk the walk, as we might say, if I was truly into local food, totally conscious of where my food came from and how I got it. I didn't manage that very well. And so I wasn't a full convert. I didn't have that ethos. But I was still left at the end of this with this sort of sense of dissatisfaction. All that is to say, this is sort of where these questions and where this heuristic that I'll get to sort of comes from. So in the world we live in, with global climate change becoming increasingly prevalent, we're aware of how that will impact our food system and sort of see these things on the horizon. It's hard not to feel that these sort of moments, especially as teachers, have this larger impact, right? This greater import. Like we had our moment, and in my case, I may have failed, right? It's hard not to feel that way. For scholars and instructors of English, the increasingly prevalent push towards eco-criticism and a more recent turn in eco-critical scholarship towards addressing global climate change illustrates the relevance of environmentally oriented studies for responding to the very real and pressing challenges of life in a changing natural world. And so correspondingly, our teaching may come to be increasingly concerned with affecting attitudes towards environment. So we arrive at the uncertainty of sort of this anecdote that I've told you. Is it working? Are we actually doing what we've set out to do in the classroom in particular? We do this in research, of course, too, but in the classroom through these relationships and these building moments. So the lessons that we craft in the classroom and the discussions that we facilitate and the materials we select to offer as a point of entry into this culture of environmentalism are they really effective in changing orientations, right, of our students? And if they are, what practices then can we locate and continue to promote, right? And if they're not, what can we do in the humanities curriculum to play a more powerful role in actually enacting those sort of changes and that attention that we want to generate? So the answer is very complex. I do not for a moment purport to get up here in 15 minutes and solve this problem, but I do want to offer a few suggestions that I've found in the very limited literature that is out there about environmental pedagogy with attention to changing orientations and attitudes. So Lawrence Buell has a quote that I want to sort of start as, or use as an entry point here. He says, "To measure the social impact of any intellectual intervention is tricky, if not impossible. Here, one can only hope." And I affirm this. I think there's a lot to that, and maybe at the end of the day, we simply do what we can. We leave our students with what we hope is a well-crafted message, and we see what they can do with it. But I think there's more we can do than hope, right? And so these are some of the more concrete strategies that I want to bring to bear in this panel about pedagogy, sort of to start us off. I believe that we need a pedagogy for environmentalism that inspires as well as instructs. This is not a novel idea, obviously, right? From its earliest onset, environmentalism has very much been about the inspired and the experienced. But how we do that, of course, is a different question. So very briefly, what I'm going to do here is three major things. I want to offer a little bit of context for the problems that we're up against. And I have to hedge a little bit here by saying I'm probably talking to a group of people who can just nod and say, yeah, I know, I've lived that. But for the sake of, we'll review what I've found so far. In the second, we will explore some best practices for environmental pedagogy. And then finally, I'll conclude by providing some suggestions for places that, in my own experience and in the research that I've done, I think we may go next that may be more effective. So, excuse me. So to begin, reading a little bit from environmental policy, which is where this started, expert Judith Laser notes that nearly all environmental disputes are at heart contests over values. They are essentially a set of fundamental disagreements over how humans ought to interact with the natural world. So to address environmental issues, one thing that we have to understand first, and I think we really have to cement in our minds as instructors, is that our task is not one simply of intellectual engagement. It is that, but it's not just that. But it's also an engagement with core values, right, which becomes a lot trickier, I think, when we try to think of it that way. It's a much more formidable challenge for environmental educators because our task becomes less this conveyance of information. Now, granted, I think most of us as instructors do more than simply deliver information, but still. And it's much more a process of very careful, sensitive connection of existing environmental orientations, students' existing values and orientations and connecting those to environmental values, is what I mean to say. And then an additional complication within that is staying power, right? So Greg Girard writes pretty extensively about environmental pedagogy in a couple of his publications. And he points out that without overt, sustained reflection on their relationship to students' pre, extra, and post-educational lives, such concerns, that is concerns with the environment, will remain academic in the pejorative sense, right? So we really have to be planting questions that remain present in our students' minds, and that's what it takes to shape attitudes. So that's one. An additional point of context we have to consider is how environmentalism is framed in American culture, right? And so I sort of see it in a couple other ways, and there's obviously more beyond this, but primarily it's framed as an abstract pursuit of some sort of aesthetic ideal, right, associated with wilderness and that experience. Or else it's often portrayed as a radical and obtrusive political ideology, right, something that's in the way of progress. And either one really distracts us from the primary concerns about ecological health and longevity and human sustainability as well. And this in turn puts our environmental values into conflict with those that are central to our American culture, such as individualism, consumerism, right? So it becomes an oppositional value. And whether this is incidental or intentional, it creates this odd paradox. So by some of the information that I found, 78.2% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24, I believe is what it was, quote, show strong support for the environment. So that's their orientation. Yet, when we talk about environment and efforts to preserve the natural world, whether that be wilderness or places where people live, it's often imagined as sort of frivolous, right, or at its worst, un-American. So this is also a paradox that we have to face. So in summary, sort of getting a lay of the land, if you will, you got to love the natural metaphors, right? You got to use them. The issues are out there, right? And students are aware of them. They know they're there. They're even interested in them in many cases, and I saw this in my class as well. But a framework for really engaging those issues in a way that's effective is still very much under formation, and I would say very much scattered. There's not really a framework per se. So we're up a lot. We're up against a lot, but we also have a lot of potential for growth and a lot of potential for impact. So what I essentially want to talk about is sort of just one small piece of that. I want to examine how fiction in particular can serve as a resource for engaging with environmental studies. Fiction may not be the first place we go. Obviously, there's some wonderful literature out there that we've probably all taught or read that we can have come to mind, right? But as a genre, it may not be the first place we go. I know when I was thinking about teaching classes about the natural world, I gravitated towards nature writers for good reason, right? Because they do incredible things. But fiction offers new opportunities. So paradoxically, I think we have to get further away to get closer to issues of environmental awareness and sustainability. So essentially we can do that, I think, through fiction, that is through metaphor, and the world building that they do in this sort of distant space. Excuse me. So the impact of fiction for a mobilizing effect has not been adequately measured, so I can't offer, unfortunately, any qualitative data or quantitative data that really gives us a sense of how this works. But it does suggest, this research does suggest, a few clear advantages. First, it can be an accessible and familiar entry point for conversations about environment, right? And I think many of us who have taught have probably experienced this. Sometimes fiction just feels safer, right, because there is that distance. Second, it can facilitate a more genuine engagement with environmental issues because of its removal from the immediate material realities of its readers, right? Again, that distance can be useful. So in allowing students to come largely to their own way of knowing, fiction may present a more authentic learning experience than models of environmental pedagogy, which attempt to transmit rather than negotiate environmental values. I'm going to place a little emphasis on those two comparisons. So this flexibility provides for a discussion and understanding of environmental values and orientations along a variety of critical frameworks that students can help locate. It's also a flexible medium for environmental pedagogy where the space of discourse, and I hope you'll follow this language, can be either exterior or interior to the participant's reality, depending on the structure or intent of that activity. So essentially that is, you can either call your students to look outside of their own experience, try to broaden their horizons, or you can turn it around the other way and try to get them to focus on how they experience the natural world from the inside out, right? So while it's important to engage with real-world applications, fiction also has a distinct benefit of allowing students to first encounter challenging environmental issues in this imaginary space, where their core values can be employed, but maybe, I hope, will not immediately invalidate alternate considerations, right? So this is my sort of what I posit. Along these lines, there's a little evidence to back this. Kira Hambrick suggests that certain fictions may create opportunities for a more comfortable engagement with the environmental issues and potential solutions. She also asserts that readers are less likely to be immobilized by fear or what she calls eco-anxiety, and by contrast may respond favorably to the call for action espoused by the narrator, the characters, or the author, right? More receptive, essentially. It also carries a popular connotation, of course, of existing outside of reality. But interestingly, this article is fascinating. I'd be glad to talk about it more in a later space. Psychologist, I'm missing the name, I apologize, I'll find that in the works cited. But a psychological paper affirms Hambrick's speculation by noting that fiction is often subconsciously processed as believable and even real. And importantly, those who experience text in an immersive way, which she calls being transported during their reading, can adopt new beliefs or attitudes about the real world based on what they learned from the story. So psychologically, we see that fiction actually does have a very real impact on how we act and what we believe. Again, people who read a lot of it are nodding and saying, yes, absolutely, right? But for some of us, in how we think about how we structure our pedagogy, maybe this is a new consideration. So again, concluding this section, these are all ideal scenarios, right? So I have to admit that act of being transported in reading doesn't always occur. It takes certain circumstances, it takes engagement and interest, and those are things we have to be careful about. But again, the opportunity is there, right? The opportunity to do more with fiction, I think, in environmental studies than maybe we've done so far. So next, I'll explore just very briefly one suggestion that I would make for a genre that I think is promising as a way forward, and interestingly enough, I'll be using a lot of what I speculate here on next fall, so check back with me and I can tell you if it was a spectacular failure or not. But essentially I'd like to talk a little bit about a genre called speculative fiction. Is that familiar to anybody in the room? Okay, wonderful. So briefly I'll just give a basic definition, but so speculative fiction is generally referred to as a genre in which these literatures directly confront the questions of how we will continue to survive and thrive in our future, right? So very much about a future-oriented consideration of our nature and the nature of the world around us. So these are often dystopic or utopic, and they deal very often explicitly with environmental and social issues, especially as those are entangled. So this kind of literature may really capture students' attention, and of course it's designed in part to alarm them to action or interest. But in doing so, I want to point out that depending on how we teach it, it also risks flattening complex environmental issues into this narrow, apocalyptic framework for imagining environmental present and futures. So this can occur if the pedagogical application of such texts neglects to engage students with a wider range of interpretations or fails to frame such texts in a more hopeful, solutions-oriented terms. So I think we have to be very careful about how we approach this sort of literature, even given its potential for what it can do. So we're in this precarious position where we need to design a curriculum that must simultaneously, keep track of the list if you want to add them up, right? Engage, transport, and challenge readers, but also avoid deactivating their investment in environmental issues by presenting such problems as insurmountable, right? And if anyone has ever taught, an environmentally oriented class, this is hard. This is a hard problem. So I think we can negotiate this, sort of working towards a conclusion by following a few best practices. First, since literature presents a facsimile of environments rather than purporting to represent the environment as it exists in reality, that is in fiction, of course, pedagogy needs to be designed to provide students opportunities to recognize and analyze the distinction between real and depicted environments. So this can take place through individual or collective discussion and reflection, and especially Girard suggests that understanding and engaging with students' previous environmental experiences, whether positive or negative, will enhance their sense of ownership and sustainability concepts, So then incorporating fiction as part of environmental curriculum provides entry points into larger environmental discourse that allow students to draw on their own experience and background knowledge. Educators can make best use of these entry points if discursive classroom spaces are intentionally designed to make use of student knowledge and encourage students to make connections between safer, fictive depictions of environments and the challenges and realities of their own experiences, so the environments they've actually lived in and know about. The second, if environmental curriculum overemphasizes students' engagement with any one temporal reality, it may misrepresent environmental issues as static or temporary, right? And I think this is a fairly important point. So ideally, environmental curriculum should be oriented along a very fluid spectrum of past, present, and future, prompting students to connect to and make meaning with each distinction without restricting their thinking in one dimension. So in the very most practical terms, a well-managed curriculum designed on this principle may help address the issue of long-term change in attitude and decision-making. When students are allowed and encouraged to draw on past knowledge, present experience, and speculate about future possibilities, they may also be able to more readily identify a continuity of environmental issues beyond one temporal distinction, beyond the right now or the past, right? That was an issue we faced in the past. And again, speculative fiction may be a really good fit for this model because it does this intrinsically. I have a little bit more, but I want to make sure not run over time and cut into our excellent other presentations. So I welcome any other questions that you have after, but let's hear from Mike. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you. I always appreciate that. So the purpose of this presentation is mostly reflection on intersections between digital humanities and nature writing, a literary genre that seems outside the purview of digital humanities. Now, before I go any further, I would invite you, if you want, to explore the following maps as I'm talking, if you want. So, if you were to put in this URL, engl2308naturewriting.wordpress.com, or if you just search TTU 2308 Nature Writing, you can get to our course blog, and in the blog roll in the right sidebar, you can find 3 maps titled Fall 2015 Map, Spring 2016 Local Nature, and Spring 2016. But for those of you who are interested in maybe only one of the maps, most of my examples in the following presentation will be from the Spring 2016 map. Notwithstanding conventions that encourage a separation between nature and culture, more contemporary essays and eco-critical studies have complicated sociocultural assumptions regarding nature. Asking what is nature also becomes a critical inquiry for 3 recent sections of Introduction to Nonfiction, in which students and I analyzed canonical and contemporary nature writing essays, as well as participated in digital humanities projects, pinning student essays onto digitally mapped anthologies that question how we mediate our experiences in the natural world. In this presentation, I will discuss the mapping assignment's parameters, the technology's restraints, and the critical foundations for the course's 3 projects. My goal is to argue or claim that despite issues with the mapping application's limited capacities, including digital projects and nature writing curriculum does not diminish student interaction with natural spaces. Rather, it invites them to consider the cultural ideologies that influence their definition of nature and their relationship to it. So over 3 sections of English 2308, which is the course number for Introduction to Nonfiction here at Texas Tech University, students and I prepared 3 course anthologies using Google My Maps, a free mapping application that allows multiple users to edit and personalize maps with pins that combine text and images. 2 of these maps have similar assessment parameters. On the Fall 2015 and Spring 2016 maps, I tasked students with writing 2 drafts of a personal essay. The first involved a standard 4 to 5 page double-spaced essay in which students engage with a personal experience within a natural space. Moreover, students should model the essay style after a nature writer that we had read during class. For instance, if they liked Gretel Ehrlich, model your essay after Gretel Ehrlich. If you liked Bill Bryson, follow him. This parameter in particular becomes important because it shifts the essay from academic analysis to a creative writing workshop. After receiving comments from me on their first drafts, students then had to consider how to revise the longer essay into a digital format. We discussed in detail how audience shift during the revision process, because a digitally constructed audience would expect brevity and visual components. For brevity, I gave students a range of word count, encouraging them to focus the digital essay on 1, maybe 2 experiences. For the latter point on visual components, I required students to include at least 1 image from their experience. I qualified my expectations for that by asking for images that visually enhance the experience written upon digitally. In other words, the visual has to help the text. If it doesn't, what's the point? For both of these drafts, I didn't leave them out in the dark, but I provided them examples of a longer draft and a pinned digital essay from a personal experience I had at Glacier National Park. The third map involves a tweaked assignment regarding local nature here on the South Plains. In the fall semester, students submitted this assignment on Blackboard, but in the spring I decided that students should use Google My Maps to pin these local nature essays. Notwithstanding the shift in submission location, the local nature assignment asked students to explore Lubbock and its surrounding areas at least twice. For these write-ups, I provided students with questions to prompt their explorations. The first list establishes where they are, and what they observe, and an argument for why they considered that location to be natural. The second list involves more reflective questions. It coincides with seasonal changes as Lubbock went from winter to spring, as well as students entering into a new section of urban nature essays. Like the personal essay map, students wrote these concise essays and included at least one image from that location. Now, if any of you have ever used technology in the classroom, and by technology we mean the internet, you know that you're going to experience difficulties, and that was the case with this project. The most prevalent technical difficulties being the editing interface and image upload. After granting access to students, many were confused with how to add and then edit their pins. While I encouraged them to visit with me for troubleshooting, eventually I created a tutorial page on the course blog that details the process of searching, including and editing a pin in Google My Maps. But by and large, uploading visuals became the most onerous task, because at that time, Google My Maps, the mapping application, limited upload to general image searches in Google or specific URLs. Because the first option proved too massive and wasn't personal, it was depersonalized, pasting image URLs into the search bar became the chief vehicle for uploading images, although this too proved difficult. Students had to ensure that they pasted the URL from the image itself and not from Facebook from the search bar, which is password protected, or from Instagram, which has an internal network. It was, to use Portuguese, it was bagunça. It was a mess. Again, I addressed these issues in the tutorial that you can find on the course blog. Since then, fortunately, Google My Maps has updated their visual options to include uploading from computer files, web cameras, and saved images on Google Drive. But the difficulties with images continue to plague these particular historical maps long after their creation. Looking through them in preparation for this presentation, many pins have lost their images, including my own. I had to go and upload mine again. Or many pins have become linked to outside shared images. This has led to an impermanence within the assignments. An example of this would be Isaiah's pinned essay from Cancun on the fall 2015 map that does not provide the personal image of cenotes, but has been linked to other images from other maps. But despite the technical difficulties and visual impermanence that we encountered, these digital maps aptly engage in critical and creative conversations about within multiple academic disciplines regarding nature and humanity's relationship with the natural world. These maps exemplify. Sorry, I forgot. I was trying to do two things at once. Oh, don't worry, we'll get to that in a sec. These maps exemplify a digital postmodern approach to the post-natural world, a space where literary scholar Dana Phillips argues, quote, representation has supplanted presence, unquote, and experience becomes an exchangeable commodity. Now, he wrote that in 1994, so the advent of social media and lifestyle blogs have further strengthened his argument. But Phillips, I argue, does not read the intermixing of nature and culture through pessimism. Rather, he reasons through Frederick Jameson's concept of cognitive mapping that, quote, that treating the imagination of the real as real would be an historically original act. Whatever our reverence for nature may have been in the past, only recently have we begun to understand it in rich enough detail for the sort of cognitive mapping we must do. Close quote. That humans should recognize those cultural and imaginative apparatuses that inform their definition of and attitude towards natural spaces becomes an important project, notwithstanding the emphasis on imagination. Environmental imagination, as legal scholar Jedediah Purdy asserts, becomes a politically practical exercise because it enables a new way of seeing the world, of valuing it, a map of things worth saving or a future worth creating. Again, maps becomes a powerful metaphor for reimagining humanity's relationship to the natural world, while his term valuing seems intentionally ambiguous, because readers value natural spaces through different cultural, economic, political, aesthetic, or personal paradigms. Identifying those imaginary connections to place and non-human animals became a discursive point at the Wildlife Society's 2015 annual conference. According to Sarah Fritz's recent presentation at a Climate Science Center seminar here at Texas Tech, some 2,000 wildlife biologists attempted to answer why wildlife matters and found that they situated their responses to personal connections with specific places and activities, as well as some kind of intrinsic or spiritual value that we really couldn't put into words easily. Value again becomes important, although it speaks to the different paradigms through which humans connect to natural locations. Furthermore, human activities intermix with unquantifiable affective connections within these spaces. Yet Fritz's assessment speaks to the difficulty of articulating or mapping mental or emotional connections. This small cross-section of scholarly conversation signals a few underpinnings for these digital anthologies, a few takeaways that we'll begin with right now. One, students engage with those cultural ideologies that shape how they define nature. Some essays, such as Jackson's on the 2016 map regarding St. James Park, work through the city-country metaphor, although that particular essay situates the country aesthetic within London itself. Another essay, Mariah, completely challenges the division, arguing that her reaction to the Lincoln Memorial constitutes a natural connection to an unnatural, constructed, artificial location. Two, students begin to identify a range of values through which they connect with nature. Among the many, some of the more popular ones cited include family, friends, and loved ones, interior reflection, outdoor activities, God, scientific inquiry, and ecological action. These last two are particularly interesting to me because they demonstrate intersections between literary and scientific inquiries. Examples of these include Benjamin's essay on Mount Rainier National Park, in which he discusses the respiratory actions of trees, something I had never considered, and in the process personifies the forest. Or Abigail's essay on Redwood National Park, in which she frames her ecologically informed existential crisis. What can I do about nature? What can I do about climate change? And frames it within an ant metaphor. In these two essays, the authors use literary conventions to shape their discussions. Such generic interventions move their essays from technical to creative nature writing. They're beginning to imagine the real as real. 3, the act of digital maps, with all its technical and visual issues, constitutes a virtual manifestation of student and instructor cognitive mapping. Through these mapping applications, students have another medium to imagine pressing cultural and ecological concerns. The emphasis on images indicates a visual level at the start for what each author values within that space, although visual impermanence has de-emphasized this component. Instead, these online essays bear witness to digital audiences about different value systems through which these students, and by extension the readers themselves, can reimagine their relationship with natural places. This becomes particularly glaring when student authors approached the same location but from different value systems. Scattered across these 3 maps, you can find 7 essays about Palo Duro Canyon, and all of them engage that particular location from a different value system. The act of these digital essays invites students, invites readers, and invites me to reconsider our emotional reactions to natural spaces and to identify again our value systems for urban and natural spaces. Or in other words, to answer for ourselves, how do I imagine nature and what is my role within it? Thank you.
I feel like almost everything I'm going to say Mike just said. So I teach Introduction to Nonfiction. Specifically, I teach a course on the personal essay. We do not focus specifically on any one topic, but nature is certainly one that comes up a lot since the American essay especially has such a rich history in nature writing. And so it definitely comes up. And the last unit of my class, and this has been the case ever since I first began teaching, even when I was teaching composition at another university, has always been a digital or visual composition. And in fact, next week I am starting the video essay unit, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So the video essay differs from, say, a video documentary the same way that a personal essay differs from a newspaper article or a newspaper documentary. And speaking about that, John Breslin, who's one of the leaders of the video essay today, says, in its intent, the video essay is no different from its print counterpart, which for thousands of years has been a means for writers to confront hard questions on the page. The essayist pushes toward some insight or some truth. That insight, that truth, tends to be hard-won, if at all, for the essay tends to ask more than it answers. Because there's a visual element to the video essay, the way it asks its questions is both through the text that it presents, but also, of course, through the images that it presents to the audience. And it does that through color, through design, through videography, all the sorts of things that visual artists have known about for a long time. So my students respond really well to this, to these essays. They are already engaged very much in a world that is both text and image heavy. All of our news today comes with text and image. All of Facebook comes with both, right? More and more, we have a graphic element to the text that we are presenting to the world. And so teaching literature in that framework presents a way to have literature inside of modern communication skills. But when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Annie Dillard, who is one of my favorite essayists and is very much a nature writer. And in her essay, Seeing, she talks about walking with a camera. She says, "There is another kind of seeing that involves letting go. When I see this way, I sway transfixed and emptied. The difference between the two ways of seeing is that the difference is like the difference between walking with or without a camera. When I walk without a camera, my own shutter opens, and the moment's light prints on my own silver gut. When I see this second way, I become, above all, an unscrupulous observer." So she's sort of arguing that if you walk with a camera, you're not going to be your best artistic self, taking in the universe. But I think that like Ansel Adams would probably disagree, that a camera is a form of artistic expression. And of course, the video essay asks us to do both. It asks us to be both writers and visual artists at the same time, and it becomes a way to open ourselves up to nature. So I'm going to show you a video that I created as an example for my students who wanted to make a video essay. As such, it's not excellent because I specifically used Windows Media Live, which is probably the worst video editing software there is, but it is free. And I wanted to prove to them, and this is something that's true, that the video essay aesthetic is very much like a homemade feel. Like we want it to feel kind of like a home video that's been crammed together, which this is true. So we're going to watch it, and then we're going to talk about the video essay. What should I do? Close it?
Reopen the file. Yeah. Try closing the other one too.
Try closing this up?
Yeah, just
Use the one on the desktop. Looking for squirrels. A love note. When I walk in the woods, I hope to see squirrels. I seek them out, peering into the canopies, cocking my ear for sounds of their passing. When there are no squirrels, every rasping leaf is a disappointment. But when there are no squirrels, a keen awareness consumes the walk, their absence creating a lingering magic. Things unexplored may cling to the hidden side of every mossy trunk. So this afternoon, as we walk through the new sprouting spring forest outside Frankfurt, holding hands and chatting, I look for squirrels as we talk about the friends we'll reunite with in America, the winter we're leaving behind in Kazakhstan. You mentioned that we'll probably never see our Kazakh friends again, and I turn my head to follow a sound, but it's just birdsong. We wonder if my books will sell as we cross the country bridge. We sit on a bench and listen. What if we can't have children, we ask each other? What if the tumor in your uterus, the unexpected surgery, ruined that for us? A year from now, we will not have to wonder if we can. We'll know that we can. And 2 years from now, we'll not be considering what we can do, but what we could do. We'll be thinking of all the things we have done and wondering what we will do next. I was walking round Grasmere Lake, bluebells blooming ankle high, and the late sun barely breaking through high mists. I wanted so much to see England's endangered red squirrel, and to know if I should buy you a ring or break things off. Recounting that memory, I wanted you to see it too, because even though I didn't see a squirrel in my looking for them, I saw instead a narrow road, lined with purple flowers and wild garlic, winding its way through an emerald hillside, a near-perfect explanation of the romantic sublime. An image, I knew even then, that would be perfected not by the presence of squirrels, but if you had seen it with me, the same way you are now seeing these German trees with me, our hands clasped in calm composure, but our eyes open and aching for any anticipatory detail.
Okay. That's it. Okay, as you probably noticed, the main scene of that video essay, a German forest, isn't present in the visuals at all. Partly that was because, like Annie Dillard, I had intentionally left my camera at home or in the hotel. We were just on a layover. We hadn't planned to stop in Frankfurt, and all my things were packed, and I didn't want to get it out. And I also thought that it was a nice chance for me and my wife to have a nice walk, so I was going to leave the camera. But as I was in the forest, I kept thinking about how amazing this forest was. I had never been in a forest so lovely, except for the one in England, which I kept telling my wife about. And so I had to find a way to represent that in the video essay. And so I chose instead, I actually videoed my herb garden here in Lubbock, but in a really blurry focus to kind of emphasize the searching and also just the color palette of this rich green, but sort of out of focus and sort of not quite sure what it was I was seeing. But on the other, so this is kind of a metaphorical image base, like both of my colleagues have talked about. But on the other hand, I also wanted to tell the story of my wife and I having a child, which is one of the main stories of my dissertation and my current book project. But the text of this image, or of this essay, is very brief on that account. And so the visuals are what lets you tell that story. And so one of the things I emphasize as I teach students is a quote from Christine Radke, who is, again, another amazing visual essayist right now. In fact, she just had a book come out this week that is amazing. And she says, writing about her own video essays, that video essays can do braiding, which is having multiple motifs in an essay, more cohesively than print can. We can truly engage with both threads at exactly the same moment. And this is something where I think the video essay becomes a way, especially to engage with nature, because we often have memories of nature, but as Mike's pointed out, we also have artifacts of nature. And having both our memories written through text, having the artifacts of videography or photos overlapping each other at the same moment allows us to create more meaning. So for example, at the end of this, I had pictures that I did take in the English forest. When I was in England, I was taking pictures the whole time. I had a travel blog that I was keeping for myself and the people I was traveling with. But in the video essay, it takes on new meaning because it's no longer just an artifact of my travel, but it's now the thing I wanted Kirsten to see, the thing I wanted my audience to see. It represents a hope and a dream more than the original picture did. So we can never recreate our own natural experiences for other people. We really cannot even recreate them for ourselves. What the essay instead does is it is a mediation between what I feel about my natural experience and what I want you to feel about my natural experience, and maybe your own natural experiences. So whether we're trying to tell people about the desert or the mountains or the forest, we can only approximate our emotions. So if we come back to Annie Dillard, in her essay on seeing, and also in some of her other essays, especially her essay Living Like Weasels, what we need is not necessarily an attachment to prose or an attachment to any one genre, but rather we need to, like she does, allow ourselves to open up to the world. We will experience the wonder of nature if we open ourselves that way. But how we record those moments, how we successfully translate them through whatever medium, I think is what becomes less important. And what I hope my students will experience as they experiment with video essays, that if we are aware of the deeper senses and open ourselves up so that we, as she says, we become the silver of the camera, then art will naturally follow. Thank you.
So thank you guys again for wonderful presentations. We have some time for questions till 10:30. Is that right, Dr. Warner? Okay.
25.
10:25. So we still have some time for questions. So I'd be happy to hear those.
This question is for Mike and anyone else up there because we all deal with environmental. Mike, you mentioned technology problems, and I was wondering, to what degree would you suggest do you suggest how to avoid that, or to use it and embrace it rather, maybe as a learning tool?
That's a really good question. Having the tutorial really helps for students, and also creating space within class period time, as well as opening up office hours for them to come and see. But I like the way that you addressed it at the end. It's something that students have to embrace, and I have to embrace, the same way that Luke talked about in his presentation about climate change. It actually becomes a great metaphor. We can't reverse all of global climate change in one day, but we can start with the particulars in our local environment, doing small things day by day. And when we encounter difficulties, we just embrace it and we try to adapt. Also looking for different, particularly for technology, looking for different maybe applications. This week I've learned about story mapping through ArcGIS, so I'm going to be looking at that for my own research, as well as possibly putting it into curriculum.
Just to go on with that, one thing that I do is not give my students time to make mistakes, which seems a little cynic. I am a cynic, but I have an assignment. So a lot of students think that I show them video essays and they think they can't do that. But then I give them an assignment where, and they are in groups, but they have one class period to make a 1-minute video essay. And I have never yet had anyone be like, we just completely failed. We couldn't figure out how to do that. Because they have phones, they have technology. So, I mean, how to use a video thing is a little bit simpler than some of these more technical things. But I kind of find that if you just give them, like, say you have about 50 minutes to figure this out, they'll figure it out in 50 minutes.
Maybe history is
Yeah.
Mhm.
This question there.
This semester, I'm teaching for the first time an undergraduate class called Ecological Literature at the 200 level at Purdue University. And my students, I'm in the English department, and the course has an English prefix, but it's enrolled primarily students in the sciences or fulfilling humanities requirement, distribution requirement. As I invented this course over the break, the idea of a multimedia culminating ecological project came to mind. I didn't have the sophistication that you had developed here. And now I'm thinking that was a really, really good idea. And the first iteration of that was yesterday when I was here, and so a doctoral assistant is there seeing the first round of presentations, but the rest of this coming week I'll be observing them. This leads to my question. I love the concept of evaluations of nature, the way that this sort of taxonomy that you came up with, meaning family and friends, interior reflection, outdoor activities, God, scientific inquiry, and ecological action. I have seen those elements, each of them, in the written journal entries that my students have been writing in response to print, traditional literary naturalism. Here's my question. Which, if any, of those evaluations are privileged in a video platform?
I don't know that I can speak specifically to like nature video essays as a whole, but the video essay as a whole tends to be melancholy, a little bit pessimistic. Because the essay as a genre has tended to be melancholy and pessimistic. And so even in the nature ones I tend to see, there are ones that are, I think they're kind of hopeful and looking for a thing that they can accomplish, like has been talked about, but at the same time maybe a little unhopeful of the big picture.
So one of the pins on the fall 2015 map was done by a student named Hannah about Tuscania, Italy. And she, in class and within this digital essay, talks about her love of God and how blessed she feels that she had this opportunity. And she actually uploaded a video as one of her visual components. However, at the time, I remember there was a slight disconnect because the video itself was very much had a different value system. It was more along the lines of reflection of being in a new place, seeing these new sights. And so I'm not sure if this helps, but having students recognize that the visual or the videos that they create become an extension of the values that they have. And so having them do rhetorical or visual rhetorical analysis of their own images and saying, what are you valuing here? Is it the landscape? Is it yourself? What are you getting at? And that will become another medium through which they can look through, they can sort of identify what's important to them.
Is your term again visual?
Visual rhetorical analysis.